Hey everyone, welcome to another Open Observability Talks podcast. My name's Jonah Kowall, the CTO at Logs.io, and I'm really excited to chat with Pranay Prateek, the co-founder and creator of SigNoz. I wanted to thank our sponsor, Logs.io, for putting on this podcast, and I'm really looking forward to the discussion today. Something we all hold near and dear to our hearts is the idea of open source observability, naturally the reason we have this podcast, but also the unification and how we can bring together a bunch of different signals and provide that observability that everyone's looking for. So it's pretty awesome to hear the things that Pranay and the rest of the team are building. I wanted to invite everyone to join, those of you that are listening to audio or listening to the replays. We broadcast live on YouTube and Twitch. And of course, you can always get the latest episode on your favorite podcast platform. So with that, I want to invite Pranay to the stage with me. Pranay, welcome. Where do you join us from today?
Hey Jonah, thanks for inviting me. I'm
Awesome.
currently in Bangalore. Pretty cool weather here.
Nice. Great. Awesome to see. I've spent quite a bit of time in your city over the years, but it's been a little while. I'm sure it's continuing to boom with the tech explosion going on. So.
Oh yeah, interesting. When were you here in Bangalore?
Yeah, I mean, I actually had a team there quite some time ago when I was at Thomson Reuters, and then also at App Dynamics. We had a pretty big presence there. So I watched the change over the years from the early parts of the tech boom into like the new modern stuff, and a lot of innovators like yourselves that are building new startups in Bangalore. It's a very hot area for sure. So it's great to see that.
Yeah, so we are also seeing like lots of new companies coming up, and I think we are, as an ecosystem, maturing a lot, taking a lot of inspiration from the
Definitely.
Silicon Valley ecosystem. And yeah, I'm seeing like new startups in new areas. So earlier we didn't have startups in, for example, in dev infra, but now or dev tools, but now we are seeing more and more startups, us being one of them. So yeah, pretty exciting times
Cool.
to be.
Awesome, man. So can you give us a little intro on yourself and what your journey was like getting up to the SigNoz creation?
Oh yeah, sure. So yeah, I am one of the co-founders at SigNoz. Primary and engineer by heart. I did electrical engineering. Me and my co-founders both are electrical engineers, and that's why you would like we worry a lot about signal and noise in our like training. So that's sort of the origin of the name SigNoz. So signal versus noise, right? So yeah, so I did engineering. Then joined work for a couple of years as a software engineer. Worked primarily in machine learning, image processing, so more on the computer vision side of things, and really enjoyed working there. So post that, worked for Microsoft as a product manager. I was working in the CRM Dynamics team. And yeah, before joining SigNoz, like starting SigNoz, I was leading product teams at a startup here in Bangalore. And that's where sort of we got the sort of understood the problem statement itself, that what's observability and like why it is very important, right? So I was leading the product team here, and I sort of the engineering team was working with me, and I would get call from the customer care team that, hey, something is wrong in the app. How do you solve it fast, right? And whenever such things happen, it's like usually fire in the hair sort of problem, right? Like you need to solve it now, you need to solve it fast. And more often than not, so we didn't have any good sort of observability tooling in place at that place. And more often than not, we would have to go to a war room more to figure out like what's going on, right? And that's where I sort of understood the problem statement. Like if you're running things in production, you want to understand how things are going. Things can go wrong. How can you get sort of proactive signals or like data on like what can be going wrong, and then proactively fix them, right? And in that company, we're like running a basic version of Elasticsearch,
Yep.
but it was difficult to maintain, right? As you know, like at scale, Elasticsearch becomes difficult to maintain. So that was there, and then we're not able to find talent to sort of run Prometheus or Grafana because running such systems are complex, and you need a like specialized talent who can sort of set the systems up for you and get that running, right?
Were you doing any tracing at the time as I wear my Jaeger shirt?
No,
or just
interestingly,
logging?
yeah. So at that time, I think all the companies mostly I see they start with logs as the first sort of signal which they want to capture,
Yeah.
and then we wanted to also capture metrics, but we're not. So we only had logs as a signal, and we didn't have like we're not had set up Prometheus and Grafana system there.
Got it.
And yeah, that's where sort of the I think I got introduced to this space that hey, like this is a very important problem, which is gonna be more and more important as like more things in a company become software driven, right? So you would run systems in production, you'd want to understand how it's going. And if you see today, like most of the real IPs of company is in software, even if it's a delivery company, the core IP is in the software, and that's where sort of the edge of the company, right? So every company wants to like be better in that. So yeah, so that sort of was the motivation or like insight on like why this field is important. And then I remember way back we started digging into, and like initially we didn't know like we had to create a tool like this. So we saw Datadog, which was sort of very good product. We tried it out, and we wanted like why is there not something like this in open source, right? Like a single tool where you get everything in one place. We had Prometheus Grafana ecosystem, but in Prometheus, you primarily get metrics, then you have to set something for logs, then you have to set something for traces, and then you sort of make them talk to each other, right? And yeah, so that's where sort of the genesis of SigNoz is that hey, can we build something in one single app which does both all of metrics, traces, and logs, and is in open source. And
makes sense. So so when did you start working on the project, and then when did you launch it, I guess? Because I've been following you, I think, since the beginning, because I was really, of course, interested in the project and like the idea of what you were trying to build. So maybe a little timeline on kind of when you started, founded the company, and then kind of when you launched it. Like how long has it been in the works for now?
Yeah, I think the company came much later. I think we founded the company in Jan of 2021. But we started working on this project on October 2020, which is when like we started writing for this. And initially we were thinking of sort of building something on top of Prometheus, Grafana, can get application metrics on top of that, right? But what we realized was that like it's very difficult to sort of get that one click through sort of experience in Prometheus, similar to what like you have in Datadog or New Relic, right? Like modern totally. So there's a huge gap between where these products current, like at that time, open source products were there, and the current SaaS products were there, right? And yeah, so that's where we realized that hey, like if we want to do this right, we have to build our own front end and sort of make a single app which like talks to different signals. And down the path, we also took the call of like having a single data store, which maybe we can come to later. But the idea was that hey, can we have a single app which is easy to maintain, easy to install, like one click install, you get started very quickly, and then you get all the signals in one place. We didn't want to have like different UI for one and then second, even setting up this different tick systems, as you might know, right, it like takes time, and like also the team needs to learn like where how to set things up.
I don't think anyone's figured out the unified data store. I mean, even when you look under the covers at most of the commercial tools, they end up using different backends for the different data types, because I think a lot of the databases haven't really evolved well in dealing with time series and event-based data like logs and traces. So I was curious when the project first started and I saw that you were running on Druid. I know that that's kind of complicated to manage and scale. And so I was watching and I'm like, oh, this is going to be a really hard project for people to run on their own. And so maybe you can talk a little bit, because I'm always fascinated in databases and data stores, like how your evolution went. Because I know you didn't want to have multiple data stores. That was obviously one of your goals in the project. And then, so how did you go from, the Druid to where you ended up? I'm just curious about that.
Yeah, I think that's been a very interesting journey even for us. So when we're deciding, like way back in October 2020, when we're deciding like which database to choose, like we probably had three main candidates. We had Druid, which was sort of more established. We had like bigger companies using it. We had Pinot, which was more upcoming, and then we had ClickHouse.
Yeah.
And like we were like not very expert in databases. We didn't have much sort of prior experience working with them. So we sort of went with the database which were like most well adopted in bigger companies. So that's why I drew it, right? And what we realized with the like as we went through the project was that, so we launched the project on Hacker News in February 2021. We got lots of sort of inputs on like, hey, Druid may be very tough to run, and sort of those were right and prescient, because we saw many people trying to run Druid, and then it's a great database, there's no doubt about that, but because it just has so many components which it needs to run upfront, I think many people were finding it difficult to like run it in their sort of local machine or like laptop to start with, right? And this is sort of the thing or like insight which we didn't have earlier, that hey, like if you want to run like open source something, and like first people would want to try it in a laptop preferably, or at max a single small machine. They would not want to set up a Kubernetes cluster, set up sort of
I mean, the most popular artifact for Jaeger is the all-in-one Docker container, where people can just start using it instantly with a single, download. So that's definitely advisable. And did you have to run Kafka with Druid all the time, or only at scale?
Yeah, so in our architecture, by default, we had Kafka. And like Kafka is another beast to manage, right?
Yeah.
So exactly. I think it was a good architecture for like companies which are using at scale. But for an open source project, which was like at very early stage, people would not sort of invest so much in like running that scale. So it needs to be very easy to run it in a single laptop environment or a single VM environment. And then as people get confidence in that, they can sort of mature to dedicating more resources, more engineers. So that's what we have seen. And like, I think for after June or July of 2020, like say 4 or 5 months down the line, we sort of decided that, hey, like Druid may be very complex for our project. And hence we sort of shifted to ClickHouse, and ClickHouse has been much better performance. So the beauty about ClickHouse is that it's like it starts very quickly. Like you can start with a single binary, get started very quickly with very little resource. You don't need multiple component, and even like if you run ClickHouse in a 4 CPU machine, it's able to handle like decent amount of scale, which people can sort of get confidence that, hey, like this database works and like this can handle a scale, right? And then we can get into like running it in bigger machines or like running it in Kubernetes clusters. But that was like really important for us, and like that sort of drove adoption for our project a lot, that it was very easy to install.
Yeah. Do you still have to run Kafka in front of it when it scales, or is that not really required?
So as of now, we don't have Kafka in our architecture, but I think we will need to introduce it because as we are seeing customers or users using us at like much higher scale, But till today, you can just run with ClickHouse, and it's
Yep.
able to scale decently well, right? But now we have also introduced logs, so we'll need to at some point of
Yep.
time
Yep. A lot
have
more
Kafka,
storage. Yeah.
yeah, have
Very
Kafka
cool.
in front of it. So, but yeah, now this time it will be an optional component. At least that's the learning from our last foray in this.
Yep. Makes sense. Cool. So I wanted to ask a little bit about how the project's going. I always take a look and see all the contributions and stars on your GitHub. So maybe you can tell us how the users and adoption have been.
Yeah, sure. So I think adoption has been really great for us, especially after we moved to ClickHouse. So we are currently at something around 7,200 plus GitHub stars. We have more than 70 plus contributors and from across the globe, US, Europe, and we have, I think, now 1,200 plus members in a Slack community. So we are having a very active Slack community where like people are sort of trying to help each other, etc. And I think at around 4,000 stars, we did an analysis on like, hey, who are the people who are sort of liking our project,
Yeah.
and what are they liking? And we found that like top was of course US and India. I think because most of the developers are there. But it's also interesting to see people from China, Brazil, Germany
Cool.
featured in sort of top five like stargazers for a project, right? Which sort of was very interesting for us because it shows that like people from all over the globe are sort of adopting the project, liking the project, right?
Yeah.
And
Cool.
yeah.
So how do you license it today? Like today it's under an open source license. I'm assuming you're going to try to keep it that way, but I'm assuming that maybe you want to build a SaaS service over time. I mean, what's the goal for the company as a commercial entity too?
Yeah, so as a business model, we're following an open core business model. So I think we'll be going down path similar to our GitLab HashiCorp has gone. So uh, most of the code will be in open source and like permissive licenses, but we'll have some part of the code, maybe a folder, which will be under more protective licenses,
Okay.
and that will be sort of the part of the paid offering. And we also plan to offer a SaaS service on top of that.
Yep.
But yeah, that's broadly the idea, that keep the bulk of the core code open source, and then for the commercial parts and the paid offerings, we can keep it in a more protected license.
Yep. And so what's your timing on some of those other things that you want to do with the company? Is it like next year sometime, or what's your kind of timeline around that?
Yeah, so we plan to launch something by like some of the paid versions by end of year. So
Oh,
maybe in
okay, cool.
3-4 months we'll have
Nice.
some more paid plans on the product, and yeah, post that we'll also have SaaS offerings based on that.
Very nice. So aside from commercial offering and support, which I'm sure some users would really love to have, what else is on the roadmap that we can kind of talk about what's coming next?
Yeah, so I think one of the core goals for them. So we recently released logs for a product. So now we have all the three signals,
Yeah,
metrics, traces, and logs in one piece, which are sort of always have been the goal of the project.
sure.
But now we have sort of, the next step is to make it very easy to for people to add their data sources and build integrations on top of SigNoz.
Yep.
So that would be one of the key focuses, that hey, like how can people, for example, start getting data from the Redis instance to SigNoz? How can they get data from their Kafka instances to SigNoz? So building the integration layer. As of now, we don't have an easy way to add integrations, and then we will sort of also open up that for like everybody to build on top, so that just the surface area of the product becomes much larger, and like people can start contributing on the project in these integrations, etc. I think which is a much easier way to contribute. And the second key piece is sort of going towards more insights on the product, insights on the data, because one of the unique advantages which we have is that we have all the three sort of signals in one data store, right?
Yep.
And what it enables us to do is to sort of do correlations across these much more efficiently, right? So you have a single data store, you have different tables for different metrics and signals, right? What we essentially think is that as of now, this differentiation in signals is like sort of artificial. Like ultimately, if you think from a company's point of view, they are trying to solve a problem much faster, right? Like that's the end goal. They don't care about, hey, are you on metrics? Is this data
Sure.
on logs or is it data on traces, right?
Yep.
And if that's the goal, and that's the goal of the project and the mission of the company, that hey, how can we make like enable people to solve their issues faster, right? I think doing sort of more proactive insights rather than sort of reactive insights would be much more powerful there. So hey, like we know that okay, your Redis call or your like particular service is taking this much time, but suddenly it has increased. So rather than you setting a dashboard and alarm, can you sort of suggest this to you?
Yes,
So this also got of sort of goes into the domain of uh, machine learning or like regression analysis, but that's sort of where we want to go as a project. That
Yep. Makes
these
sense.
these ideas should be much more easier and like much more upfront rather than just a dashboard based approach.
Yep. So, two questions for you. One is on the integrations that you mentioned. Are you going to have like a way to package content? Meaning, your example, like let's say I have a Redis server and I want to get all the signals from it. Will I have a package that includes certain dashboards, certain types of alerting, and obviously the data collection package together? Like, how are you going to do those integrations and make it easier for users? Like, what's the vision there?
Yeah, so as of now, we have sort of not defined it like in a lot more detail, but the idea is that if you have a Redis instance
Yeah,
in SigNoz, you can create an integration where you specify the URL, you specify the sort of port, credential, etc.
sure.
And then this should be able to pull in or push, like the Redis instance should be able to push data to SigNoz collector, right? Which is where
So it's more about data collection than the visualization and the rest of the other pieces.
yeah, so two
Yeah,
pieces, right? First is like you want to get data from this from your Redis clusters very easily to SigNoz,
sure.
and the second is can you like visualize these metrics, right? So current even today we have a concept of dashboards in SigNoz where you can sort of plot any types of metrics, right? And it's so that dashboard piece we can create uh, like a folder for Redis dashboards, right? Which will have sort of all the standard panels. And if you have in the study your data through the integration
Hmm.
and then add that uh, dashboard JSON file in a dashboard, then you should be able to see your Redis metrics basically.
Got it.
So
Okay, makes
yeah,
sense.
so two independent concepts. One is like dashboards, which are like independent components, and then data ingestion through Redis. And then I think the third piece also is how do we send data out from signals, right? Essentially, one of the key things are alerts or
Yep,
like
yep,
signals, like how do you send to Slack, how do you send to Opsgenie. So
right.
those are also like one key area where like people should be able to create integrations on top.
Yep, makes sense. So, I know that logging is the newest signal for you, and same as open telemetry. It's the newest signal for open telemetry. But since you're looking at it new and building a new UI, when you look at all the logging tools out there, they all kind of look the same, right? They do the same thing. They have the same timeline view. It's kind of like here are the fields. And are you rethinking that at all in terms of what you're doing with logging? Because I feel like everyone just kind of does logging the same, and it's okay, but it's not particularly well integrated with the other signals. So like, how are you kind of looking at it from a unified perspective?
Yeah, so we have so current version which we have launched is sort of basic version V1 version, which does the basic job. You
Yeah,
have the logs, lines, and
you
then
have a
you have the data set.
timeline, and yeah,
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 so I think that's needed, and that's like the basic thing which people expect, right?
sure.
But the way we are thinking about it going forward is the like two sort of areas where you want to focus on from logging perspective. One is aggregation and much better slicing and dicing, because the key problem is logs is finding the right log. Right? It's not about like, can you see the details of the log? That's a trivial problem. The main problem is how can you sort of plot the charts. For example, you want to see from that hey, by service name, what's the number of counts, right? By service name, where coming from this Kubernetes cluster, what's the log lines which you're seeing, right? So and because we use ClickHouse as our data store, that's sort of the superpower of ClickHouse. Like aggregation, etc., is much faster, right? So that's where we'll focus on from logs perspective. That can you do much stronger filtering, much stronger visualization on top of that to find the logs which really matter to you, right? And then you can just get the details of that and find what problems are there, right? So that's one much better aggregation, much easier group by, and that actually much faster on SigNoz because underlying we are using a columnar database, right? And we have sort of benchmarked this with Elastic for aggregation and operations. This like ClickHouse is much faster. So we'll surface that like much on top. And the second sort of thing is the point you mentioned, which is like integrating from traces, logs, and metrics, right? So for example, one of the things which you're thinking of is you have the trace page. Now, can you go from there to see the details of the logs, right? So you have trace attributes. If you click that trace attribute, it just goes directly to the logs page and filters your logs based on that.
Yeah.
So much easier sort of filtering and correlation between logs, traces, and then metrics, right? So these are the two sort of key areas, because I think even Uber sort of, there was a recent blog by Uber engineering folks, and then they mentioned that 60 to 70% of their logs queries are aggregation queries, right?
Right.
And that's where sort of the main bandwidth or like the main effort of the team goes, and that's why they sort of switch to ClickHouse. And I'm guessing that would be the case for most of the bigger companies, that like finding that right log is more important, and then diving deeper into that.
The challenge is if you do aggregation, it's obviously much harder to do free-form search. So one of the biggest challenges in observability is trying to deal with the unknown unknowns. And that's oftentimes where logging is particularly useful, and why you need to have a decent full text search is because sometimes you're looking at a problem that you don't know, that isn't an aggregated query, where you're trying to actually analyze a particular instance of a problem. And that's why, you know, some of the open source tools that always start with a metric before you go to a log are problematic. And oftentimes you want to start with a trace, or you want to start with a log, and then you want to look at metrics related to that. So, you know, oftentimes the troubleshooting workflow changes. So we've got a couple of questions coming in on the database side.
Sure.
Some of them are somewhat related, and I'm happy to chime in on a couple of these. So on the Prometheus side, obviously super popular data stores like Elasticsearch, but Asaf Masika is asking, how does it compare with Cortex? And obviously Cortex is fully Prometheus compatible. ClickHouse itself, although there is Victoria Metrics that's built on top of ClickHouse, it doesn't necessarily have Prometheus compatibility. So what are you doing in SigNoz to create compatibility for those that maybe are using really popular tools like Prometheus?
Yeah, so we don't, like the data store is still ClickHouse. So we don't use anything like Cortex. And ClickHouse itself is horizontally scalable, right? So it can scale as much as you want. Sure. We allow support for PromQuell, which is a query language.
Oh, you do? Okay.
Yeah. So we allow support for PromQuell, but underlying we convert that PromQuell to a sort of ClickHouse query and then run it natively on that, right? So that's the approach we are taking. We are not sort of supporting Cortex as a database, as a remote store.
Makes sense.
Fundamentally, we are using columnar databases as the storage layer first.
Have you tested the PromQL compatibility? Because this is also a big thing that people are now testing. Like Victoria Metrics, although it provides PromQL, is not very compatible with Prometheus. It turns out that they don't pass all the tests particularly well.
Yeah, so the way we are thinking about is that many of our users want just to create metrics, right? So for the say 80% of the users, we have provided a query builder, which is like you can use UI to sort of create metrics. You can filter based on different things. You can filter based on group by query, right? So 80% of the users will allow, like I think query builder will suffice, which they can use to write metrics, etc. And then we support PromQL and ClickHouse native queries, right? So PromQL will be there, and it's for people who are more comfortable with that. But we are sort of really focusing more on making the native queries, people to write native ClickHouse queries much easier. So and that's on SQL. So ClickHouse native queries SQL format. So many people should be able to write based on that. Right. So that's the sort of direction which we are taking from a query language perspective. Because we found many people are not even comfortable. Like even PromQL, if somebody wants to write advanced query, it's not very easy, and not many people are very comfortable writing. Advanced
very true.
queries.
And so, how do you deal with metric rollups? For example, like, do you have the ability to roll up metrics to trend them over time? Like, is that user configurable?
One second, I'll just check my camera. Has it gone blurry?
Yeah, maybe put your hand in front to make it focus. There you go. Now you fixed it.
Oh, okay. Sorry, what was the question?
So the question was, how do you deal with metric rollups? So that's one of the things that the databases like Cortex and other time series databases handle, is when I take a metric over time and I want to roll it up a certain way, it provides the scalability if you're collecting a lot of data. So like, do you do rollups today in SigNoz for metrics? Is that part of the plan to do something like that?
So are you saying that if I have, say, 1 hour granularity data, you want to roll up to 1 week? Or
sure. It's usually 1 minute, and then you maybe want to move to 1 hour, after a certain number of weeks or months, just to deal with scalability.
Yeah, so currently we don't have like rollups enabled, but in ClickHouse, we have a concept of materialized views, which is basically essentially doing the same thing, that it aggregates based on, it can aggregate based on time intervals and store in a different table, right?
Got it.
That sort of increases the storage requirement, but because you are just having so little like number of hours or number of days, that like doesn't blow up. So that's the place where we will go to support materialized columns, to support rollups. But as of now, we don't have anything.
Got it. So another question that Asaf asked right after the others is comparison with Elasticsearch and Loki. Obviously, Elasticsearch is super popular for logging. I did want to mention that one of the things early on in my work on the Jaeger project and working with the team at Uber is they used to be big Elasticsearch Elk users. They moved actually to ClickHouse for logging because just because of the scale and cost of managing Elasticsearch. The downside is that they had to build a lot of UIs and capabilities on top of ClickHouse because there's no Kibana for ClickHouse. And, they built a translation layer for some time, and, that had its own set of issues because the APIs keep changing. So yeah, I just wanted to chime in on that one. Did you have anything else to add on that question around Elasticsearch or even?
Yeah, so we have compared, and we're still like in early stages of comparing. We will maybe soon publish benchmarks on that. But what we have seen is that Elastic is very heavy in terms of ingestion. So if you want to ingest data, it requires lots of CPU memory requirements, and that's where like many times it fails, right? ClickHouse is much better in our experiment, at least. It's like half or 1/3 of what Elastic would require in terms of ingestions. And that's also because like in Elastic by default, you index everything. Well, in ClickHouse, you can specify what you want to index and sort of create index for that. Right. So that's there. And I think Cloudflare also recently published in Monitorama, like they were making a presentation that they have moved from Elastic to ClickHouse, and their ingestion, like resource requirement, has reduced by 8x. So that's like a huge scale. So ingestion is much more efficient with SigNoz and ClickHouse. In terms of Loki, I think Loki is at par or maybe even better, but Loki doesn't allow you full text search. Like there's very limited amount of full text search you can do. So I think where we stand in terms of Elasticsearch versus Loki is sort of a middle ground where like ingestion performance is like decent, not very resource intensive.
Yep.
And you can also do some sort of full text search. Of course, we also allow you to specify which fields you want to index on, so that like if you are always querying on those fields, you can index it and get much faster performance. But even full text search, the performance is much better compared to Loki.
Yeah, and I just posted in the comments the talk from Monitorama this year that you were referencing. The team at Cloudflare put together with for ClickHouse. So definitely worth checking out if you're interested. But once again, I think we need a nice UI, and maybe SigNoz is the nice UI for querying log data in ClickHouse that people are looking for, right?
Yeah.
It's definitely a lot more efficient and cost effective than running Elasticsearch. The challenge, with Loki is as you said, is the full text search, which it does not handle. But that makes it super cheap because the data is just on S3, and that's a pretty nice solution.
Yeah. So as I mentioned, in the sort of Elastic to Loki spectrum, we are sort of somewhere in between.
Yeah.
So that's where we are.
We're actually working, as you know, there's OpenSearch, which is the open source version of Elasticsearch, and we're actually working on an S3 storage system for OpenSearch that'll make it a lot more efficient in terms of long-term storage, but it does not solve the ingestion challenge that you were mentioning, Pranay, because obviously dealing with ingestion on Elasticsearch or OpenSearch requires Kafka and a bunch of other things to deal with. Back pressure and queuing that are just kind of part of the challenges with that database. So
does Elasticsearch not have a S3 sort of long-term storage capability?
So
today?
They have searchable snapshots in the commercial version of Elastic that gives you some of that. In the open source, it doesn't exist, but we're working on it. And the concept over time is to actually decouple. Right now there's a cluster and there's a lot of communication that goes on in the cluster. Is how do we decouple the write pipeline, meaning how I commit and index data and store it, and the read pipeline, or how do I read pipeline? I read the data from storage and serve the queries. So over time, the idea is those become all decoupled microservices. You have shared storage behind it, and it just makes it a lot more efficient, similar to the design of Loki, where you have a bunch of microservices, everything's in S3, they're just querying and you scale them independently. They're querying or writing or aggregating. And so the idea is, instead of running a cluster and dealing with all of the challenges, how do we build something that's more stateless? And that, I think, is kind of where we want OpenSearch to be in a year or 2 years, and you'll see some of that actually coming out.
So is today is ingestion and reading coupled in Elastic?
Yes, definitely. It's a cluster. So you're basically running, shared communication between the different nodes. The data is replicated between the different nodes. The queries are striped across the nodes. So it's definitely a stateful database that runs in clusters. It's not decoupled by any stretch today. So
and I think one problem we saw with Loki was that when you're querying, they bring all data to I guess the ingester, or they bring all data to memory and then their own query, because they don't have an underlying DB. How do you plan? What's the plan for addressing that problem? Or are you thinking about that in Elasticsearch?
So there are things you can do, like prefetching and various other pieces, and you can actually store quite a bit of data in memory as well. And I think Loki now has a bunch of different caching layers that enable some of those use cases to make it faster. But obviously you can't predict what all the queries are going to be, and you can't fetch all the data prior to the query being run. So I think there's always going to be some of those challenges inherent with that design. So yeah, we'll see.
But so the way we are trying to handle this is through like Loki and Elastic is trying to handle this through better caching.
Yeah. Yeah. Same with Cortex does the same type of thing because it also uses S3. So cool. So I wanted to ask a little bit about the project itself, and I'm going to just put the roadmap up on the chat just so that people know kind of what's going on with the project. And then they also have a link to the GitHub. But I did want to ask about how people can get involved, how they can contribute to it as well. So maybe you could share a little bit about that.
Yeah, sure. So I think we have got lots of contribution from like contributors in SigNoz already. But I think a couple of key areas where we are like actively looking for contribution is finding like testing SigNoz in different languages and frameworks and sort of reporting and like maybe sharing documentation on what that is. Because as you know, like the surface area of the product is very big. Like OpenTelemetry itself supports so many languages, and then even in those languages there are so many frameworks, right? And as a small team, we can't sort of create docs for everything. So if people can, and like people are trying with different languages and frameworks. So if people can create docs or like try for that language in which they're comfortable with, and then sort of share docs with us, that would be very helpful. I think the next piece could be trying to improve the documentation, because as such, OpenTelemetry itself a new project, and it's also sort of evolving project also, right? So sometimes APIs change, and we spend a lot of time in improving the docs and keeping it updated, right? But would love contributions from the community on if they find something wrong in our docs, please like do a pull request. And our website and our docs are also open source, so they can do that. And I think the third piece could be the integrations things which we are planning on. It's not live yet, but soon we'll sort of create a framework on how people can add integrations. And then I think that would be much easier areas to contribute in compared to like, I think core backend, because core backend generally requires a lot more time commitment, like context on the project, which sometimes like contributors don't have. But I think integrations may be a great area for contributing. Like there are like lots of integrations which can be enabled on SigNoz, on sending different type of alerts, on integrating different type of data sources which can come in and like be integrated in SigNoz. So that would be a great if like community can.
So we didn't talk much about OTel. You mentioned it like 2 or 3 times in the last couple of minutes, but sure. I'm quite sure that you have a support for OpenTelemetry protocol, OTLP, in the product, or do you use an exporter today?
Are you talking about like how do we send data to SigNoz?
Yeah,
like
from OTel. Yeah, how does it work with OpenTelemetry, for example?
Yeah, we support OpenTelemetry instrumentations. You can send, like use OpenTelemetry libraries to start sending data, like instrument your applications and start sending data to SigNoz. So that's like one of the base of SigNoz, that you can instrument with OpenTelemetry. Start like we are native to OpenTelemetry. We started the project with OpenTelemetry in mind. So you can send data from OpenTelemetry libraries to us.
Got it. Yeah, so you support OTLP, which means you don't need an exporter. You can just send native OpenTelemetry directly to the backend, which is a nice design for sure. And obviously you support logs, metrics, and traces from OTel. But do you support other ways of getting data into the platform? Like, is there support for Prometheus natively to get metrics in? Is there support for other types of standards that people are using?
So I think OpenTelemetry collector itself provides Prometheus receivers, right? So we have like you can enable Prometheus receivers in your OpenTelemetry collector and send data from your Prometheus exporters directly to us. So, for example, you can send data from node exporters to SigNoz and like start plotting those metrics.
So your goal is all open telemetry in terms of getting data into the platform, not supporting like we do at Logs.io. We have to support FluentD and FluentBid and Beats, and we give a customer a huge list of things they can use to send us data, which is nice, but also customers say, which one should I use? And we have to say, oh, use so and so or this and that.
Yes, we are sort of taking the route of default OpenTelemetry support, and we are seeing that's like serving like 80% of the use cases of our customers, and that's fine for us for as of now, because being a small team, we don't want to sort of integrate different libraries and builds exporters for all of those. So as of now, we are supporting OpenTelemetry, and I think even OpenTelemetry allows you to send through FluentBit, right?
Definitely.
I think the collector allows you to send through FluentBit. So of course, like there may be like many protocols which we don't support, but like we'll take a 80-20 approach to.
Yeah, it makes sense. It saves you a lot of time because all these companies that have to build agents, it's a big engineering team required to do that, and it gets very expensive, and a lot of it's not that differentiated. So focusing on OTel is definitely the way to go, especially as a startup. So yeah, I think that totally makes sense. One of the things I'm kind of starting to think about, speaking of open telemetry, I just wanted to run it by you because we've got a few minutes left.
Sure.
So we built, and I noticed in your documentation that you use it, is we built a span metric processor that takes the traces and it makes metrics out of them. I'd like us to do the same with logging, where you actually take a bunch of logs and then you can pre-aggregate it in the collector. Without just sending all the logs, you could send a metric that summarizes logs.
I think that's a very interesting idea.
Yeah.
Because I think many people want to see metrics from logs, and if you can create
definitely. Yeah, we have some features that do this in our product, but having it in the collector, I think, is also, has its advantages in terms of not having to send all the logs to the service. You can, just summarize it. So there's definitely some.
So what would be the use cases for that? Like, will people want to not send logs, and that saves the network sort of layer? And but then you lose the ability to query it.
You do. But like when you think about in a great use case is like an access log. Access logs are all the same, right? It has what it is, but it also has what's the error code, what's the response time. What if I could just take those handful of metrics that are in an access log, send them as metrics, and then I don't have to send any of the access log to get the operational data. Similar to the trace metric processor, where if you want to get performance data from your traces, but you don't want to send all the traces all the time, the trace processor lets you get that data, and then you can sample the traces and not have to send them all. So you could also sample the logs, just send me the 500s, maybe send me 1% of the 200s that are in my access log. So you could do all kinds of nice things to reduce data volume.
Have you seen many people trying to sample logs? Because I've seen people sampling traces, which is like very common, but I've not seen many people try to sample logs.
Oh yeah. If you're really busy, you have to sample logs, and where it's actually even more common is in flow. So like network flow analytics, which are also logs. So we have customers that can't send all the flows. They want to send a sample set of flows from the network. So they'll, configure sampling for flows and sampling for logs. We definitely get that.
Interesting.
So, yeah.
And this is sort of more on network monitoring through logs rather than sort of core DevOps type logs.
Network monitoring, security monitoring, not so much for application logs, but for other things that are very verbose or a very high volume. You have to look at the risk reward, right? If I'm going to collect all of this data that shows something is okay and fine, why am I going to spend all that money and time doing that, right? It doesn't make sense. You really want to collect what is going to be useful versus what you may or may not use at some point in the future. So yeah, it's definitely
That
where.
makes a lot of sense. We have not actually thought about that.
Yeah,
We
definitely.
are sort of primarily been focused on application, but now you are
Yes,
telling
sure.
me, I see that
Yeah.
maybe there is.
But as you go, and I know some of your examples like monitoring Redis or monitoring MongoDB or ClickHouse, for example, now you're moving more into infrastructure where, you know, some of those logs may not be useful. I mean, Redis generates huge volumes of access log type data that you want some of it. You definitely
Yeah.
want the metrics from it, but you don't need all of the 200 okay, 500 millisecond response time. Okay, that's fine. I don't need that, you know. So yeah, definitely. Cool. So just before we wrap up, is there any other things that you wanted to chat about today before I kind of cover a couple news items and yeah?
No, I think we covered almost all of them. I think
Cool.
maybe just a shout out, like take a look at SigNoz.
Yeah, for sure.
And we have a very active Slack community, so have a look at that. And if you have any questions around observability, how we are doing it in a single app, feel free to join the Slack community and happy to chat more.
Very cool. Oh, and I didn't realize now you have paid support, which is awesome to see. So folks in companies who want support, they can definitely pay you for support, which is great. And the Slack community is linked on the site, but I'm also going to put it in the chat. Slack, I'm just throwing it in there. Yeah, so
there's a short link. It's okay. Can I?
It's a little long, but they can also get it.
Let me send you a chat.
Yeah, you can just post it in there, or I can get it. Oh, that's the one that's on the site. Oh well.
You can in chat.
Oh, okay. You can just here. I'll post it in. Oh, okay. This is much shorter link.
Yeah.
So here's the proper link for the Slack. So use that one instead to jump on. And yeah, I think that's probably it. So before we cover a couple of news items, I just wanted to thank you for joining us. Super useful discussion. You can stick around. I'm just going to actually talk about a couple of news items,
sure.
You know, going on in observability. But I did want to thank you for joining us, and best of luck on the project for sure.
Yeah, and thank you for like inviting me on the project. And I think I learned a lot from logs.io, and we'll chat more on like what we're doing there.
Yeah, definitely. I'm sure we'll be in touch. And one of the things I did want to mention that's part of the news is KubeCon US is coming up in about 2 months. I will definitely be there. I'm doing the Jaeger maintainer talk with one of the other maintainers at Jaeger, which will be great. Are you going to be at KubeCon this time?
Yeah, I'm in KubeCon.
So you can see Pranay at KubeCon. Do you have a booth this time, or are you just showing up?
No, I'm just showing up.
Yeah.
You can ping me on my Slack and we can chat, or like you can
just Slack or LinkedIn. Pranay is always around, and yeah, there's lots of great discussions going on at KubeCon and around KubeCon, not just for sponsors. Obviously, I'll be there. Logs.io will be there, and there'll be lots of other great open source companies at the event. So super looking forward to that. I did also want to mention in November, those who are unaware, there's another open source conference in Germany called OSMC, which I have never been to, but I'm going to be speaking there as well. And so will Dotan, who's the other co-host of this podcast. So definitely check out this conference. I haven't been to it, but I've heard good things. I'm throwing it in chat, osmc.de. It's a German open source conference that looks pretty good. It's rather small, especially compared to KubeCon. And I will also be in Chicago next week for the AWS Summit. So always happy to meet folks there. In terms of project news, there's been a couple of new things. There's a new release of Prometheus that just came out last week. It's got some great new capabilities. They're improving the web UI a little bit that lets you do things kind of in the management console. We've had a new release of Jaeger, some incremental improvements. We're going to talk about some of the bigger stuff at the KubeCon session. So for those of you that are there, awesome. For those of you that aren't, all of the KubeCon sessions end up on YouTube anyway. So definitely check that out. And I think those were probably all the news items I had off the top of my head, but we will have more news next month. Definitely looking forward to our episode next month, which will be a great one. And with that, I just wanted to thank Logs.io, our sponsor for the podcast. And once again, thanks, Pranay, for joining us today.
Sure.
And have a good evening and a good morning to those in the US. So
thanks,
cool.
Jonah, and thanks everybody for joining in.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Have a good day.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.